Barack Obama, Selma Voting Rights March Commemoration Speech. I must begin because at the Unity breakfast this morning I was saving for last and the list was so long I left him out after that introduction. So I'm going to start by saying how much I appreciate the friendship and the support and the outstanding work that he does each and every day, not just in Capitol Hill, but also back here in the district. Please give a warm round of applause for your Congressman Artur Davis. Vocabularies and synonyms. Unity, N, solidarity, unanimity, unification, integrity, wholeness. Appreciate, V, be grateful, recognize worth, acknowledge, outstanding, ADJ, superior, excellent, distinguished, phenomenal. Applause, N, clapping, expression of approval, ovation. It is a great honor to be here. Reverend Jackson, thank you so much. To the family of Brown AM.E, to the good Bishop Kirkland, thank you for your wonderful message and your leadership. I want to acknowledge one of the great heroes of American history and American life, somebody who captures the essence of decency and courage, somebody who I have admired all my life, and were it not for him, I'm not sure I'd be here today, Congressman John Lewis. Vocabularies and synonyms. Reverend, N, clergyperson, clergy, clergyman, priest. Acknowledge, V, verbally recognize authority, recognize, accept. Capture, N, catching, apprehension, imprisonment, seizure. Decency, N, respectable behavior, courtesy, decorum. I'm thankful to him. To all the distinguished guests and clergy, I'm not sure I'm going to thank Reverend Lowry because he stole the show. I was mentioning earlier, I know we've got CT Vivian in the audience, and when you have to speak in front of somebody who Martin Luther King said was the greatest preacher he ever heard, then you've got some problems. And I'm a little nervous about following so many great preachers. But I'm hoping that the Spirit moves me, and to all my colleagues who have given me such a warm welcome, thank you very much for allowing me to speak to you here today. Vocabularies and synonyms. Distinguished, ADJ, famous, outstanding, dignified, famed. Preacher, N, person who gives religious instruction. Mentioning, ADJ/N, remarking, speaking of, inferring. Audience, N, hearing, audition, listener, crowd. You know, several weeks ago, after I had announced that I was running for the presidency of the United States, I stood in front of the old state capitol in Springfield, Illinois, where Abraham Lincoln delivered his speech declaring, drawing in scripture, that a house divided against itself could not stand. And I stood and I announced that I was running for the presidency. And there were a lot of commentators, as they are prone to do, who questioned the audacity of a young man like myself, haven't been in Washington too long. Vocabularies and synonyms. Announce, V, make a proclamation, declare, release, inform publicly. Scripture, N, Bible, guidebook, prayer book, canon, declare, V, make known clearly or officially, affirm, assert. Audacity, N, recklessness, daring, boldness, bravery. And I acknowledge that there is a certain presumptuousness about this. But I got a letter from a friend of some of yours named Reverend Otis Moss Jr. in Cleveland, and his son, Otis Moss III, is the pastor at my church, and I must send greetings from Dr. Jeremiah A. Wright Jr., but I got a letter giving me encouragement and saying how proud he was that I had announced and encouraging me to stay true to my ideals and my values and not to be fearful. Vocabularies and synonyms. Presumptuousness, N, showing little respect for others by doing things you have no right to do. Proud, ADJ, self-important, appreciative, honored, noble. Fearful, ADJ, horrifying, frightened, nervous, scared. And he said, if there's some folks out there who are questioning whether or not you should run, just tell them to look at the story of Joshua because you're part of the Joshua generation. So I just want to talk a little about Moses and Aaron and Joshua, because we are in the presence today of a lot of Moseses. We're in the presence today of giants whose shoulders we stand on, people who battled, not just on behalf of African Americans, but on behalf of all of America, that battled for America's soul, that shed blood, that endured taunts and torment and in some cases gave torment and in some cases gave the full measure of their devotion. Vocabularies and synonyms. Endure, bear hardship, encounter, experience, undergo. Taunt, n/v, provocation, teasing, provoke, reproach, tease. Formant, in a sound spectrum, that have a greater intensity. Torment, n/v, severe mental distress, be or make very upset. Like Moses, they challenged Pharaoh, the princes, powers who said that some are atop and others are at the bottom, and that's how it's always going to be. There were people like Anna Cooper and Marie Foster and Jimmy Lee Jackson and Maurice Ouellette, C.T. Vivian, Reverend Lowry, John Lewis, who said we can imagine something different and we know there is something out there for us, too. Thank God, He's made us in His image and we reject the notion that we will for the rest of our lives be confined to a station of inferiority, that we can't aspire to the highest of heights, that our talents can't be expressed to their fullest. Vocabularies and synonyms. Atop, adverb, upon, over, above. Confine, verb, enclose, limit, constrain, cage, circumscribe. Inferiority, noun, deficiency, inadequacy, weakness. And so because of what they endured, because of what they marched, they led a people out of bondage. They took them across the sea that folks thought could not be parted. They wandered through a desert, but always knowing that God was with them and that, if they maintained that trust in God, that they would be all right. And it's because they marched that the next generation hasn't been bloodied so much. Vocabularies and synonyms. Bondage, slavery, enslavement, subjugation, servitude. Wander, move about aimlessly, digress, get lost, meander, roam. Maintain, keep, preserve, protect, uphold, sustain, bloody, adj, bleeding, bloodstained, blood-soaked, hard-fought. It's because they marched that we elected councilmen, congressmen. It is because they marched that we have Arthur Davis and Keith Ellison. It is because they marched that I got the kind of education I got, a law degree, a seat in the Illinois Senate and ultimately in the United States Senate. It is because they marched that I stand before you here today. I was mentioning at the Unity Breakfast this morning, that my debt is even greater than that because not only is my career the result of the work of the men and women who we honor here today. Vocabularies and synonyms. March, walk with deliberation, advance, parade. Debt, money owed to others, obligation, duty, liability. Career, course, path, occupation, job. My very existence might not have been possible had it not been for some of the folks here today. I mentioned at the Unity Breakfast that a lot of people been asking, well, you know, your father was from Africa, your mother, she's a white woman from Kansas. I'm not sure that you have the same experience. And I tried to explain, you don't understand. You see, my grandfather was a cook to the British in Kenya. Grew up in a small village and all his life, that's all he was, a cook and a houseboy. And that's what they called him even when he was 60 years old. They called him a houseboy. They wouldn't call him by his last name. Vocabularies and synonyms. Existence, life, continuation, presence, survival. Folks, family, clan, kin, household, people, relatives. He had to carry a passbook around because Africans in their own land, in their own country, at that time, because it was a British colony, could not move about freely. They could only go where they were told to go. They could only work where they were told to work. Yet something happened back here in Selma, Alabama. Something happened in Birmingham that sent out what Bobby Kennedy called ripples of hope all around the world. Vocabularies and synonyms. Passbook, a book issued by a bank or building society to an account holder. Ripple, n/v, wave, wrinkle, flow, sway, fluctuate. Colony, outpost, protectorate, dominion, ruling. Something happened when a bunch of women decided they were going to walk instead of ride the bus after a long day of doing somebody else's laundry, looking after somebody else's children. When men who had PhDs decided that's enough and we're going to stand up for our dignity. That sent a shout across oceans so that my grandfather began to imagine something different for his son. His son, who grew up herding goats in a small village in Africa, could suddenly set his sights a little higher and believe that maybe a black man in this world had a chance. Bunch, N/V, collection of something, gather in group, assemble. Dignity, N, excellence, nobility, grace, grandeur, prestige. Chance, N, fate, luck, odds, destiny, fortune. This young man named Barack Obama got one of those tickets and came over to this country. He met this woman whose great-great-great-great-grandfather had owned slaves, but she had a good idea there was some craziness going on because they looked at each other and they decided that we know that the world as it has been it might not be possible for us to get together and have a child. There was something stirring across the country because of what happened in Selma, Alabama. Because some folks are willing to march across a bridge. So they got together and Barack Obama Jr. was born. So don't tell me I don't have a claim on Selma, Alabama. Don't tell me I'm not coming home to Selma, Alabama. I'm here because somebody marched. I'm here because you all sacrificed for me. I stand on the shoulders of giants. I think the Moses generation, but we've got to remember, now, that Joshua still had a job to do. As great as Moses was, despite all that he did, leading a people out of bondage, he didn't cross over the river to see the promised land. God told him your job is done. You'll see it. You'll be at the mountain top and you can see what I promised. What I promised to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. You will see that I've fulfilled that promise, but you won't go there. Vocabularies and synonyms. Bondage, N, slavery, enslavement, servitude, subjugation. Fulfill, V, bring to completion, accomplish, effectuate. Promise, V, one's word that something will be done. We're going to leave it to the Joshua generation to make sure it happens. There are still battles that need to be fought, some rivers that need to be crossed. Like Moses, the task was passed on to those who might not have been as deserving, might not have been as courageous, find themselves in front of the risks that their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents had taken. That doesn't mean that they don't still have a burden to shoulder, that they don't have some responsibilities. Vocabularies and synonyms. Passed on, PHV, acquired, endowed, granted, inherited. Deserving, ADJ, worthy, meritorious, commendable, due. Burden, V, encumber, strain, overload, overwhelm, load. The previous generation, the Moses generation, pointed the way. They took us 90% of the way there. We still got that 10% in order to cross over to the other side. So the question, I guess, that I have today is what's called of us in this Joshua generation? What do we do in order to fulfill that legacy, to fulfill the obligations and the debt that we owe to those who allowed us to be here today? Now, I don't think we could ever fully repay that debt. I think that we're always going to be looking back, but there are at least a few suggestions that I would have in terms of how we might fulfill that enormous legacy. The first is to recognize our history. Vocabularies and synonyms. Previous, ADJ, former, prior, premature, ahead of, preceding. Legacy, N, inheritance, heritage, heirloom. Enormous, ADJ, very large, colossal, gigantic, immense. John Lewis talked about why we're here today. But I worry sometimes, we've got Black History Month, we come down and march every year, once a year. We occasionally celebrate the various events of the civil rights movement. We celebrate Dr. King's birthday, but it strikes me that understanding our history and knowing what it means is an everyday activity. Moses told the Joshua generation, "Don't forget where you came from." I worry sometimes that the Joshua generation in its success forgets where it came from. Vocabularies and synonyms. Celebrate, commemorate occasion, jubilati. Various, adj, miscellaneous, differing, different, diverse. Success, favorable outcome, accomplishment, achievement. Thinks it doesn't have to make as many sacrifices. Thinks that the very height of ambition is to make as much money as you can, to drive the biggest car and have the biggest house and wear a Rolex watch and get your own private jet, get some of that Oprah money. And I think that's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with making money, but if you know your history, then you know that there is a certain poverty of ambition involved in simply striving just for money. Materialism alone will not fulfill the possibilities of your existence. You have to fill that with something else. Vocabularies and synonyms. Height, altitude, top part, crest, peak, apogee, apex. Materialism, desire for possessions, utilitarianism. Strive, make great efforts to achieve or obtain something. You have to fill it with the golden rule. You've got to fill it with thinking about others. And if we know our history, then we will understand that that is the highest mark of service. Second thing that the Joshua generation needs to understand is that the principles of equality that were set forth and were battled for have to be fought each and every day. It is not a one-time thing. I was remarking at the Unity Breakfast on the fact that the single most significant concern that this Justice Department under this administration has had with respect to discrimination has to do with affirmative action. Equality, similarity, balance, egalitarianism, equilibrium. Remark, v/v, comment, observation, notice and comment. Affirmative adj, being agreeable or assenting, affirmatory. That they have basically spent all their time worrying about colleges and universities around the country that are given a little break to young African Americans and Hispanics to make sure that they can go to college, too. I had a school in Southern Illinois that set up a program for PhDs in math and science for African Americans. And the reason they had set it up is because we only had less than 1% of the PhDs in science and math go to African Americans. At a time when we are competing in a global economy, when we're not competing just against folks in North Carolina or Florida or California, we're competing against folks in China and India, and we need math and science majors. This university thought this might be a nice thing to do. And the Justice Department wrote them a letter saying, "We are going to threaten to sue you for reverse discrimination unless you cease this program." And it reminds us that we still got a lot of work to do, and that the basic enforcement of anti-discrimination laws, the injustice that still exists within our criminal justice system, the disparity in terms of how people are treated in this country continues. It has gotten better. And we should never deny that it's gotten better. Vocabularies and synonyms. Reverse, n/v, opposite, reversal, turn upside down or backwards. Discrimination, bias, partiality, prejudice, antipathy. Disparity, difference, discrepancy, distinction, divergence. But we shouldn't forget that better is not good enough. That until we have absolute equality in this country in terms of people being treated on the basis of their color or their gender, that is something that we've got to continue to work on, and the Joshua generation has a significant task in making that happen. Third thing, we've got to recognize that we fought for civil rights, but we've still got a lot of economic rights that have to be dealt with. We've got 46 million people uninsured in this country, despite spending more money on healthcare than any nation on earth. Vocabularies and synonyms. Significant, adj, important, critical, consequential, vital. Uninsured, adj, not covered by insurance. Recognize, identify, acknowledge, admit, perceive. It makes no sense. As a consequence, we've got what's known as a healthcare disparity in this nation because many of the uninsured are African American or Latino. Life expectancy is lower. Almost every disease is higher within minority communities. The healthcare gap. Blacks are less likely in their schools to have adequate funding. We have less qualified teachers in those schools. We have fewer textbooks in those schools. We got in some schools rats outnumbering computers. That's called the achievement gap. Vocabularies and synonyms. Adequate, ADJ, enough, sufficient, commensurate, sufficing. Expectancy, anticipation, expectation, prediction, outlook. Outnumber, exceed in quantity, exceed, surmount. You've got a healthcare gap and you've got an achievement gap. You've got Katrina still undone. I went down to New Orleans 3 weeks ago. It still looks bombed out. Still not rebuilt. When 9/11 happened, the federal government had a special program of grants to help rebuild. They waived any requirement that Manhattan would have to pay 10% of the cost of rebuilding. When Hurricane Andrew happened in Florida, 10% requirement, they waived it because they understood that some disasters are so devastating that we can't expect a community to rebuild. New Orleans, the largest national catastrophe in our history, the federal government says where's your 10%? Vocabularies and synonyms. Waive, give up, let go, abandon, set aside, defer. Disaster, accident, trouble, calamity, hazard, tragedy. Catastrophe, calamity, adversity, devastation, fatality. There is an empathy gap. There is a gap in terms of sympathizing for the folks in New Orleans. It's not a gap that the American people felt because we saw how they responded. But somehow our government didn't respond with that same sense of compassion, with that same sense of kindness. And here is the worst part, the tragedy in New Orleans happened well before the hurricane struck because many of those communities, there were so many young men in prison, so many kids dropping out, so little hope. Vocabularies and synonyms. Empathy, understanding, affinity, compassion, sympathy. Sympathizing, ADJ, commiserative, sympathetic, compassionate. Compassion, tender feeling, benevolence, kindness, mercy. A hope gap. A hope gap that still pervades too many communities all across the country and right here in Alabama. So the question is, then, what are we, the Joshua generation, doing to close those gaps? Are we doing every single thing that we can do in Congress in order to make sure that early education is adequately funded and making sure that we are raising the minimum wage so people can have dignity and respect? Are we ensuring that, if somebody loses a job, that they're getting retrained? And that, if they've lost their health care and pension, somebody is there to help them get back on their feet? Vocabularies and synonyms. Pervade, affect strongly, spread through, infuse, penetrate. Retrain, train again, especially for a different vocation. Pension, benefits paid after retirement, allowance, payment. Are we making sure we're giving a second chance to those who have strayed and gone to prison but want to start a new life? Government alone can't solve all those problems, but government can help. It's the responsibility of the Joshua generation to make sure that we have a government that is as responsive as the need that exists all across America. That brings me to one other point about the Joshua generation, and that is this, that it's not enough just to ask what the government can do for us, it's important for us to ask what we can do for ourselves. Vocabularies and synonyms. Stray, wander, get lost, deviate, meander, roam, drift. Responsive, ADJ, quick to react, active, answering, receptive. Responsibility, accountability, obligation, amenability. One of the signature aspects of the civil rights movement was the degree of discipline and fortitude that was instilled in all the people who participated. Imagine young people, 16, 17, 20, 21, back straight, eyes clear, suit and tie, sitting down at a lunch counter knowing somebody is going to spill milk on you, but you have the discipline to understand that you are not going to retaliate because in showing the world how disciplined we were as a people, we were able to win over the conscience of the nation. I can't say for certain that we have instilled that same sense of moral clarity and purpose in this generation. Bishop, sometimes I feel like we've lost it a little bit. Vocabularies and synonyms. Fortitude, N, strength of mind, bravery, grit, firmness, instill, V, implant, introduce, imbue, inculcate. Retaliate, V, get even with someone, revenge, return.